Hello and welcome to an ORF digital discussion on the India-China face-off. We are joined here today by Lieutenant General D.S. Hooda, former Northern Army commander, and Suhasini Haider, Diplomatic Affairs Editor at the Hindu. Thank you both for joining us today. I'll start with my first question to General Hooda. General, in the past few weeks, we've heard a lot about differing perceptions around the LAC in Eastern Ladakh. And I wanted to get your perspective as a former Northern Army commander in that area. What is India's perception of the alignment of the LAC, and what bearing does that have on the current crisis?
So, Angad, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here as part of this conversation. I think it's an important point that you raised about the LAC, because there seem to be many sort of misperceptions about what the LAC actually is. And some people say it's not delineated, not demarcated. It's some sort of a fuzzy line. Now, it is a fact that the line of actual control has not been marked on maps and exchanged between India and China. But the fact also is that the LAC exists. And say of the almost 800 kilometers in Ladakh and, of course, other areas in the northeast, in most places, there is no difference in perception between India and China. It's only in a few places that, we feel it should be further to the east, and the Chinese feel it should be further to the west. And these are areas where disputes occur. Having said that, let me make one thing clear. As far as we are concerned in the military, we are absolutely certain about where our LAC lies. It's marked on our maps. It's been approved by the government of India. And soldiers on ground know exactly where this LAC lies, up to which point they have to patrol. And so as far as we are concerned, Angad, anybody who steps to the west of this line technically is in Indian territory. Let us get that clear. As far as we are concerned, there is no such thing as disputed areas. You can't have a border, let's call it the border, the LAC. You can't have a border where we are not sure as to where it lies. So yes, Pangong Tso, there is a difference in perception about whether it should be at finger 4 or finger 8. But we are clear that our alignment is at finger 8. The Chinese have intruded on our side, and they currently are in Indian territory. That should clearly be our position. Now, how it's to be handled, how it is to be resolved is a completely different issue. Also, just one more small point. In areas where there is a dispute about where exactly the LAC lies, both sides have been patrolling in that area, and it's been a well understood convention that in these areas, in order to make sure that tensions don't arise, there will be no permanent infrastructure constructed. There will be no permanent presence of soldiers in these areas. So patrols will go and come back. And again, that's where I find this Pangong Tso incident is serious, because they are on our side and they're building up permanent infrastructure.
Thank you, General. So Hasni, coming to you and sort of the broader India-China issues at play here. The timing of this can only be understood as very strange. The world is in the grip of this pandemic, and everyone's sort of distracted really by home front problems. So what do you perceive regarding the timing and motivation behind this this buildup of troops and infrastructure on by the Chinese on the LAC? Do you see it as, say, COVID related, driven by an impulse to distract from those issues, or purely opportunistic based on things like exercises, Indian Army exercises being deferred and things like that?
Well, thanks a lot for having me on. Then I'd like to just pick up from where General Hooda left it, which is the fact that no one, and especially now when we're looking at 1 month since the reported Pangong Tso incident, we're not sure when the build-up started. It was probably somewhere towards the end of April. But certainly the Pangong Tso incident that several reports have come out about, and about the skirmish between the soldiers on both sides, many injuries and all the rest, is about a month old. And in this month, I can tell you, every expert has made one thing clear. Even if they disagree on every other issue, they are very clear that this is a change from the past. In the past, there would be these skirmishes. Certainly, they would occur when the snows melted. And certainly, they would occur in some of the areas where we are seeing a standoff. But in fact, for 3 or 4 specific reasons, it is very clear that what China has done in the past month at the line of actual control is a breach from the past few years. The first being, and this is according to officials on the ground, the numbers of soldiers that we have seen them come into in each of the incidents between the two sides. The second is the number of places where we're seeing them. So we're not seeing like a Demchok event or a Tumar event or what we've seen in the past as well at Pangong and other places. We are seeing actually from Nakula and Sikkim and to about, I think it's 1,200 kilometers upwards, we're seeing these incidents at various points. The third is that, as General Hooda said, the sense is, and obviously we're living in the dark a little bit because the government has refused to really make anything very clear at this point, that at these areas, and many of them are areas which have not been points of contention, like the Galwan valleys, and many of them have been areas that have not seen this kind of, very brutal and aggressive kind of posture, violence between the two sides. What we're seeing is the Chinese side bringing tents, pitching them there, digging trenches. We're also hearing about light armor at various places. Now, what that essentially means, regardless of how much inside the LAC they are in, and these are things that will be proven over time. Satellite pictures seem to indicate that Chinese troops are certainly inside what India considers its patrolling area. That is a violation. So the fact that they're not, just clashing and moving back, the fact that they are digging in, does seem to indicate there's something much more serious here than people had expected. So now that we've done away with the first question, is this a tactical move? Then we have to move ahead, and obviously we can talk about that at greater length, about how strategic this is, how far ahead China may have been planning it. Is it just about the strategic vantage point that the LAC gives them, whether it is to try and stop us from building a highway there, whether it is to, as you said, take advantage of the lack of exercises happening at a certain point, whether it is to to divert attention from their immediate problems with the coronavirus issue, or whether it is to remind India, as India gets into tighter coalitions on its maritime sphere, that, hey, we're still here at your line of actual control, and you are the only member of that coalition. I'm talking about the Quad, of course, who actually holds a land boundary. So that's one question. Is it that strategic? Or are we getting into even larger geopolitical issues? Are we looking at the fact that the US and China are in this rivalry, and China is in fact pushing itself out in different directions, South China Sea as well as the LAC, Kazakhstan, where we hadn't heard earlier of this kind of problem between China and their troops. And finally, and I'll leave it over there, is this about history being made? Because there is a sense that this might have been something being planned for the last year or so, since India made its move on August 5th with the dilution of Article 370, the division of the states, the map making that followed that, as well as the statements made in Parliament that said we will take back territory, not just held by Pakistan, but also by China. So I leave it there. There are all these various reasons. It could be one of them, it could be none of them, and it could be, I mean, it's definitely at least a few of them, but it could just be all of them.
Right. So, I mean, obviously, there are definitely a multitude, clearly, of factors that could be driving a Chinese calculus on this. And of course, we may never know. They may never come out and say exactly what it is that that has them so riled up. But on a more sort of tactical level, General Hooda, I was wondering what your thoughts are on Chinese concerns regarding infrastructure in the region, particularly the road along the Shyok River to Daulat Beg Oldi. And how much of this is perhaps a reaction to that infrastructure push that's happened in the region over the last, say, 5 or 6 years?
So Angad, I'm basing it on my experience of having served there, and having dealt with some of these disputes like Chumar and some other issues that happen on the border. My sense, Angad, is this whole infrastructure development issue that the Chinese raise is more of an excuse. Whenever they want to show some aggressive behavior with a completely different intent, they will try and raise this issue that, you people are building infrastructure in your areas. We have generally told them, where there is no dispute, there is no problem. And in our depth areas, we will do it. And I have generally seen that, they don't push it beyond a point. Now, a lot is being talked about this DSDBO road. The DSDBO road is actually almost 10 years old. So it isn't as if it's a road that we have constructed, recently. Why it came into prominence is because a bridge over the Shok River on this road was inaugurated last year by the Raksha Mantri. But Angad, let me tell you, when I was the army commander, we had built the bridge. It is just that it got strengthened, made into a more permanent bridge in 2019. Otherwise, the bridge over the Shok River was made in 2016. So the road has existed, the bridge has existed. We have landed, large transport aircraft in the DBO ALG in the past. So yes, there is some concern. As I said, they raised this issue. There is some concern that the huge infrastructure advantage that the PLA held is now slowly reducing. But and this is my sense, that just our push to infrastructure being a trigger for the kind of actions that they're doing on the LAC, I don't think that would be it. Probably a bigger intent, as Swasni's also pointed out. I think there are larger issues at play here.
And on the subject of the road, for example, is the presence of artillery in that hot spring sector, close enough to interdict the road? Is that a concern, or do you see that more as posturing to force some sort of a negotiation or a settlement?
So, they can always move artillery. So the road is actually from its closest point about 7 to 8 kilometers from the LAC. So from their side, they can always interdict it with artillery. So that is not too much of an issue. Where exactly this current imagery of artillery guns is, we don't know, because the exact location is not given. But as far as distances are concerned, but then the opposite is also true. The artillery from our side can also interdict their roads, and we have sufficient deployment. I'm not going to the exact areas, although I don't think it will come to that stage that we start firing artillery guns at each other. I think we are a little far away from that.
We've heard some remarks from certain quarters about this being sort of another Kargil, or at least like another Kargil. But my understanding is the terrain and the conditions along the LOC are far different from those along the, I beg your pardon. My understanding is that the conditions in the terrain along the LAC are far different from the conditions along the LOC. And just the nature of the rocks and the soil along the LAC makes, building permanent infrastructure, bunkers, buildings, things like that, a much more complicated affair. Does that sort of stand scrutiny?
Yeah, I wouldn't compare it to Kargil. Kargil was a much larger intrusion, spread out over a much larger area. The depth to which they had come in, the criticality of the areas that they had occupied. I mean, they were literally overlooking the Srinagar-Leh highway. I think it would be overstating if we compare it to Kargil. I am not underplaying the seriousness of it. I think it's a serious situation. I think it will take some very hard bargaining, before we can find a resolution. But again, to compare it to Kargil would be overstating it in many ways.
I think to both of you, there are concerns that China could use Pakistan to put pressure on India in this situation. for example, through actions along the LOC. How do you see that dynamic going forward?
I would say one should always be prepared for that outcome. So I don't think it should be a concern. I think it should be an actual expectation that we should be prepared for. And General Hooda would be better placed as Northern Commander. That I'm sure what the kind of scenario they dealt with. Let's remember also the reality has changed on that side because of the CPEC and because of the fact that not only does that line run through what is Pakistan occupied Kashmir, claimed by India. It runs through areas that that come very close even on the other side, whether it's Gilgit-Baltistan, and China has an interest in there. And let's remember the third point, which is that it abuts one of the areas that China is most worried about, which it has actually military both at the border as well as at the boundary as well as internally, and that is Xinjiang. So if you were to look at it from all 3 points of view, that this is the CPEC, China's connection to Gwadar, China's connection on the sea, on this entire Belt and Road Initiative project. The second part being that as far as Pakistan is concerned, this is in POK area and abuts then Xinjiang. I think we should be prepared that China would definitely use that as one of the factors. However, in the past, what we have seen is that and General Hooda could correct me that when we do see a lot more action on one side, the other side seems to go a bit more silent. And that might be so as not to escalate things out of a certain level of control.
Yeah, Angad, so I broadly, sort of agree with what Suhasini is saying. We need to be wary of, we need to look at this, we need to plan for if there is a certain amount of collusion that takes place between China and Pakistan. Let us also remember, Angad, Ladakh and Jammu and Kashmir is the only area where you have borders both with China and with Pakistan. And therefore, this is one place where actually direct pressure can be put. Will we see it happening to a very large extent? I don't think so. There is enough pressure that China is sort of exerting already on India. Let us see how far it goes. In case they feel this is not sufficient, they need to do something else. If they need to ramp up something on the LOC with Pakistan, it possibly could happen. Pakistan would be happy to exploit any problem that is there between India and China. So let's have no doubts about that. So we just need to be careful. Will we suddenly see a sharp rise in what's happening along the LAC? I don't think so.
Certainly, I mean, I think now that we have heard at least, I think 5, if not 6 statements from the Chinese side saying the situation is stable and controllable, what it essentially means is they have done or achieved what they perceived as what they wanted to do. And now it's about talking, and now it's about discussing it. And from our point of view, if there was going to be an escalation, then presumably it would have already happened in the last month.
So this brings me neatly to my sort of concluding question, as it were. What do you see as the off-ramp or off-ramps from this standoff? Should this be used to get both sides to resolve their differences along the LAC now itself, or will it return to the status quo prior to, say, April 2020? Would that be sufficient? What do you see as not just the Chinese imperatives we've gone into, but what are the Indian imperatives now going forward?
Swashni, will you go?
I would, whichever you prefer, if you'd like to go first.
Okay, so Angad, let me just sort of wade into this. I think we should not get too ambitious about what finally we are going to achieve. If we can just, even achieve status quo ante, I think that would be a fairly significant step. Because the way the Chinese have come in, the number of places that they've come in, the strength they've come in, the kind of constructions and the preparations that they've made, it's not going to be easy also for them to quickly step back. So that's why I'm saying let's not get too ambitious. Let's just look at status quo ante if we can achieve that. As far as will this provide an opportunity for us to start discussing and finalizing between the two sides about an agreement of the LAC? I don't think of. And even in the best of times, the Chinese have seemed reluctant to clearly define the LAC. I don't see this as a stepping stone, although we could say that let's go ahead and do it. But to expect the Chinese to sort of agree to this due to this incident, I'm not certain that will happen.
So, Hasni?
Angad, I'd like to start by saying I agree that off-ramps should be spoken about when we really think that we are in a position to at least go back to what is our minimal posture. Our minimal posture is not just that we go to status quo ante, that there is a de-induction of troops from the site, but also, and I think this is something that experts say we have learned from the negotiations at the Depsang Plains in 2013, that we also need to know what the end point of withdrawal is. That is to say that if the Chinese troops are going to be withdrawing, we also need to know where they go. It's not enough just to clear standoff points. So if that is our minimal position, that's what we are going to accept, and I would think that there is no off-ramp possible where India accepts Chinese occupation of Indian territory, then we have to have patience and not look for a solution immediately. Nobody is saying this is going to be like 1986 in Sundarang-Chu before we had our 1993 agreement between the two countries. So we're not expecting a 7-year standoff. But it would be a huge mistake if, having seen this kind of a buildup, that the outcome ends up changing in any way the realities on the ground, because those would have repercussions not just in our bilateral relationship. It would have repercussions on the kind of security situation we face at our other with our other adversary, with Pakistan, but it would become a sort of signal in the neighborhood as well. So I don't think we should think about those as possibilities for the moment. I think there is also a broader geopolitical question. There is no doubt in anyone's mind that where we are standing today is probably the precipice of a whole new Cold War between the US and China. That is, what we have seen so far is nothing compared to what we are going to see between those two countries if they are not able to come to some sort of understanding. What that's going to mean is that on every issue, we will be expected to choose between the two. As I said earlier, we don't have the luxury many other countries in the world do. We do have this land reality with China. It's not just still a disputed line, but a boundary line with China of more than 3,000 kilometers. China has a serious position in most of our neighborhood. So we cannot afford to be seen as being part of one coalition against another. We need to deal with the situation bilaterally. I think that's what you were hearing when you heard India say categorically that we told U.S. President Trump, for example, that the negotiation with China is a bilateral one. That when the Australian Prime Minister and Prime Minister Modi discussed shared security challenges, they came back very clearly and said, we did not discuss China or the situation of the LAC. What is India trying to signal there? That we understand that this is something we have to deal with bilaterally. I think as time goes on, we are going to be under a lot more pressure to change that situation. And I think if there is to be a long-term off-ramp and a long-term working together on this very tricky situation at the line of actual control, then it can only come if the belief on both sides is we are not working against each other as part of blocks, that we are actually just dealing as India and China. I know it's easy for a lot of people to now say, oh, well, Doklam happened and then Wuhan happened and the two leaders met, and so nothing, that was a huge failure because we're right back where we started before Wuhan, or even worse. I think it's necessary to see a process. If a process has worked for a certain amount of time, and certainly people do feel that the period after Wuhan saw a new level of confidence at the LAC, then this will be a setback, but not a permanent one. If, on the other hand, the situation continues to fester, and we don't see from China a willingness to back down and to actually do this de-induction of troops, then I think we have to just stick it out, have patience, and look for long-term off-ramps instead.
So no easy decisions and no clear outcomes from this. So Hasni, General Hooda, thank you so much for being with us. I think the Defense Minister's statement will be sort of our guiding principle going forward, which is Indian pride and Indian security will not be compromised. So at the very least, a return to status quo ante, and perhaps best case, we can see some sort of resolution, maybe immediately, maybe further down the line. That's all for now. Thank you so much.